Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sati Speaks by Saahas For Cause. Saahas For Cause is a nonprofit organization that works to uplift the quality of life of South Asians in Southern California. And Sati is Saahas's domestic violence prevention program. My name is Pallavi Dhawan. I am the Director of Domestic Violence Policy for the Los Angeles City Attorney's Office. I am also honored to be on the advisory board of Saahas For Cause and to be with you here today during October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Today, we are talking about gender-based violence.
Hi, everyone. My name is Neil Iyer, and I'm a USC student studying international relations, chemistry, and nonprofits. And I also work with Sahas as a case manager for our domestic violence cases, our public benefits and health insurance enrollment cases. And then I also work, of course, in Sati for IPV prevention.
I'm Sheetal Ayatan, Clinical Manager for Family and Women Wellness. So I work with Neil uh, for domestic violence intervention and prevention through our program. And today's discussion, let us start with the one case that put India on the world map as the rape capital of the world, right? And that was the Nirbhaya case in 2012. I was in India, I believe, at that time, and I remember being so horrified of what was happening. And I think I was also part of one of the vigils. And here we are today in 2024, back to a very similar case, which I think what triggered me the most about it is somebody possibly on social media or on news channel calling it Nirbhaya 2. So 12 years apart, we have a very two very similar cases about rape, and instead of seeing any improvements, we are just like now numbering them, like Nirbhaya 1, 2, and how many more was my question there. And what I saw even with Sahas youth was kids were very triggered, right? And the South Asian diaspora was very triggered. And that brings this discussion forth, like there's so many violence that happen against women in our South Asian community that we are not talking about, right? These two rape cases got a lot of traction, but there are so many that we don't talk about. I remember we have talked about honor killings that happen in certain communities if they marry out of a particular caste or something. We have had the Kuki Meitei tribe rapes again. I think that was last year or the year before last, where women were also being part of this conflict by helping men capture other women from the other tribe to be raped, to be gang raped, and it was horrific. We have this year seen after in Bangladesh, after the government fell, Sheikh Hasina government fall, there's been a civil unrest, and again, what we see is the minority women being raped, right? If you look at Pakistan, there's been a long-standing history of conversions through forced marriages on the minority women, and that's so traumatic. And again, I think one of the biggest things that has happened in the past 5 years would be the Afghanistan situation where Taliban has taken over and how the position of the women has been reduced, right? You have to, like, such strict gender norms have been enforced. And what I find more unfortunate is that many women wanted this change in the community. So let's just discuss, like, why and how of the gender based violence in our community and beyond.
I think one of the good points you mentioned was kind of how there are so many different conflicts going around in South Asia that are not they're not as interconnected like politically, and yet we see in every single situation that somehow women are kind of the first casualty in these wars and conflicts, or even just in social upheaval in general. And that makes me also think about kind of the state of the world, or just all the conflicts going around the world right now, including armed conflict like Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Gaza, Congo, other parts of Africa, Asia, and then Latin America, where there's not necessarily international conflict, but there's still conflict within the country. And I think that also leads to a lot of these a lot of this gender-based violence. And I think a lot of times we don't even think about how big of a scale this kind of stuff happens on. And then along with those conflicts, you have things like refugees, you have health crises, you have environmental issues that are all really sort of intersectional that I think intersectionality is kind of like a new sort of buzzword that's come into play. But it really is just so many overlapping issues, and somehow at the end of the day, it's like women are typically one of the first victims in any of these kinds of conflicts. And yeah, it just reminds me of something someone at Saahas once said, or not Saahas, a partner institution, I think, that like gang violence is connected to bullying, is connected to school violence, is connected to intimate partner violence, is connected to child abuse, and connected to elder abuse, and it's all connected. And I think that's very important when we kind of think about the root of these issues as well as how we kind of want to mitigate them. And I think there's this view as we talk about South Asia and these conflicts around the other parts of the world, it's usually like this other part of the world, as if it doesn't happen here. And I think that's one thing that we need to address is that it happens everywhere, gender-based violence, and that means it can look differently, but that means it still happens. And then second, I think is also that there's always this kind of view, like you said, putting India on the map as the like world's rape capital. And there are things like that where we have these views of other countries outside of our Western sphere that are usually not in a good perspective, or like that these issues only affect them, things like that. But then I also want to address kind of the social determinants of health, which are the external kind of factors that affect community and individual members' health, which includes things like your neighborhood and your environment, your health and healthcare system, the social aspects, education, and economic stability. And so when you look at these places ravaged by colonialism and other violent conflicts across the world, naturally, these poor health conditions and poor living conditions are going to increase the rate of gender-based violence because health is a a risk factor for intimate partner violence. And so um, I guess on that note, if we could, I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about why it is that the women are the first casualty in wars and conflicts, and then um, building off on that into kind of the risk factors and protecting factors for intimate partner violence.
I mean, it's so interesting listening to you talk about the global landscape and how large scale events impact vulnerable populations like women and children. So things like that you touched on were like climate crisis, natural disasters, wars. And, you know, all of that, it's true that it does impact women and children who are, I think we need to remember they're vulnerable to begin with because of systemic inequalities. Mm. So in a perfect world, they're a perfect, right, in quotes world, they're already unequal. Mm-hmm. Because of systems that we have in place that we've created that have built in them these inequalities, right? So even without things like climate crisis or war, we have systems in place that reinforce traditional gender norms. So the world is kind of a reflection of systems. And when the world is shaken up through disaster or war, these systems and these systemic inequalities are amplified. But it's certainly not the case that India is the only example of a country where rapes happen or where gender inequality is present, though I think, yes, in the West, we hear a lot about other countries, Neil, like you pointed out. It makes us feel safer, I think, when we can look to an outside of ourselves as a country or an institution and say, oh, it's not happening here, or it's not happening on the kind of level it's happening in other countries. We treat our women well here. Insert, typically Western country like the US, where we all know, and we can talk more about the work that we do individually. I mean, I work in domestic violence policy. I spent 13 years as a prosecutor in handling things like murders, rapes, attempted murders, sexual assaults, the sorts of things that are happening, so frequently that I was overwhelmed with a caseload that was full of, dead women and children. And we, I think we have to kind of reflect and look at what's happening also in our, not just in our communities, but in our homes, because that's where obviously a lot of this violence is happening. When we talk about the global scale, we're looking at it in a way that has been captured by the media and, to some extent sensationalized because it is so horrifying. But really, we also need to remind ourselves, like, this is happening every single day inside our homes. And that is, maybe on a smaller scale, but it's happening because these larger systems outside of us are enabling it.
Mm-hmm.
I actually really like that point. Like the larger systems enforce kind of the violent international conflicts that we see, but at the same time, they also reinforce the domestic issues that are unseen. And I feel like for domestic violence awareness or prevention month, that I think that's one main goal, right? Is that we are always seeing on the news or hear on the news this side of the conflict rates this other side, and the same from the other side of the conflict. And I feel like sometimes we don't address the actual issue of like these are innocent people whose lives and livelihoods are getting stripped away. And then at the same time, I think domestic means like in your home or like home country, home itself. And I think before we even get into anything, I think we need to understand that or like be open-minded to the fact that this does happen, one in our domestic country, it happens in our domestic homes, and it doesn't all look the same. I
Mm-hmm.
think that is another important thing is that we all assume it's either direct rape or direct physical violence, that the domestic violence goes underreported or even unrecognized.
Mm.
So I think at some point it would also be good to kind of touch on what that might look like, so that people actually know what DV can look like, and does look like for people like us in our communities.
Right. So 2 points, right? Three. So Pallavi, what you said, very important. It's easy to sit and look at our televisions and be like, oh, this is happening in that country and judge, or have an opinion about them. I'll just recount an incident. I was talking about the Nirbhaya rape case, which was a gang rape case, right? And I remember like how international media was talking about and how national media was talking about it. That's also the mid-year I moved to United States. And as soon as, I think very soon after, or maybe the case had already begun when I had moved here, was the gang rape case of a college student by a group of football players. And it was just as horrendous. And there was a discussion in the community, like with my friends who were in the United States already, like, oh no, in India it's underreported, and all those things. And I was like, uh, it is underreported here too. And that's something I had realized when I was going through my domestic violence training, because we had survivors who had come to train and become advocates, right? And people, I mean, there was somebody who had mentioned to me how they had not reported the physical violence they had gone through. So we overgeneralize when we say like it's been underreported here, or it's more egalitarian here. Um, those are very broad strokes. And like Neil said, when we are comparing or when we are blaming, what we do not look at is, but somewhere, someplace, somebody is getting abused. Somewhere, someplace, there is a violation of their, personal will, right? Violating their space. And the other point I wanted to add is regarding the risk factors, Neil, right, that we're mentioning. Like, when do we have these risk factors? What are the risk factors for these? Like, okay, in any community that there is high rates of violence and crime, this will happen. Unemployment rates are high, this will happen. If communities have easy access to drug and alcohol, this has happened. If unstable housing, right, food insecurity, if there is not if there are communities with high level of social and environmental disorders, like you both mentioned, these are like some of the risk factors for our community where violence will prevail more. And bringing it back to domestic violence or intimate partner violence, the numbers are high, correct? Especially in the South Asia. I mean, I wouldn't want to say especially. Numbers are high, let's put it that way. In the South Asian community, the latest data we have is like 1 in 4 women go through some kind of an abuse, right, at home. So once again, I think we should delve into when we say domestic violence, intimate partner violence, it's not just physical, correct? There's emotional violence, there is financial abuse, there's digital abuse, there's spiritual abuse, like anywhere where you are being coerced to do something, and because of fear you have to do it. I think we should count all of those in. And it would be also wrong to believe that it's only happening to women, right? Or it's only happening in heterosexual relationships. It's happening in heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships. It's happening to women, it's happening to men, right? And the stats is, I think, 1 in 9. And again, both of these statistics are pretty recent: 1 in 4 for women, 1 in 9 for men in the South Asian community in the United States. So, Pallavi, if you remember, we had we were there together talking about domestic violence, and we were showing these same statistics. And it's very difficult for community leaders to believe that this happens in our community. I mean, I'm talking community leaders because if that is what community leaders think, I'm sure the pattern repeats in the general community, in the South Asian community as well, right?
I remember that, and I have thought about that conversation a lot since then. And it's, I think, and again, a reflection of kind of the defensiveness, right? Like, this can't be happening in our community.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a form of othering when we're saying something like, this only happens in those communities that aren't, like, we're really well educated, model minority. We don't see this kind of a problem, which is really dangerous, because that's the sort of mentality that kind of keeps the conversation from coming out into the light. It's the sort of thing that, encourages silence. It keeps victims from coming forward because, and this is not just true of the South Asian community, but generally, like, they're not going to be believed, is the fear, or there will be retaliation of some sort, right? There are all sorts of reasons that victims don't want to report, and that I do think that's reflected in the numbers,
Mm-hmm.
which are those numbers, those statistics, like, in that conversation we had in that community forum, the conversation or the comment that we got was challenging those numbers. Like, how do we know these numbers are accurate? And what's interesting about that comment is that probably those numbers are lower, right?
Mm-hmm.
The person was correct to say maybe the numbers aren't accurate, but they were suggesting that the numbers were too high. Whereas we were saying, like, they're probably too low because most victims, or the majority of victims, aren't reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to take that and circle back to something that Neil had said earlier, and that, Sheetla, you remarked on as well, that, when we talk about domestic violence, we know, because we're in the field, that doesn't, and, it's not limited to just physical violence. But a lot of people don't know that, like, that domestic violence takes many forms, and it's not always about physical abuse. It's about power and control. And that can sometimes manifest in physical ways, but a lot of abusers don't ever have to raise a hand to their victim because they're controlling them successfully in other ways. So I also think when we talk about domestic violence, we're not always capturing those other forms of abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other comment I remember from that forum was someone saying they didn't believe that the numbers could be what they thought were high numbers, right? The statistics that you reported that we think, we're fairly certain are probably underreported.
Mm-hmm.
They were of the opinion that they were too high because it's coming back to me now. I think I blocked it out, but the full context is coming back to me. If domestic violence were so prevalent or as prevalent as the numbers suggest in our community, we would see, that victims would be divorcing, and we would end up with a society with divorces and broken homes.
Mm-hmm.
So the person, at the same time they were challenging the statistics, they were almost, the way I interpreted it was they were suggesting that, that divorces, there was some judgment implied in that. Like, this is going to result, if we believe these numbers, we're going to end up with broken homes, which is not like a logical, progression, but that was how they had connected it in their minds, in their mind. And it's just, it was very shocking, I think, to all of us, or to a lot of us there. So
That's,
I think I can say that this person was, a South Asian, and this person was also male. Because I know that when we talk about, we need men to be part of this conversation. That's my point. And so I'm really glad Neil is here to have that conversation, to join the conversation, and to spread the word. Like, we have to absolutely engage men. And I know we're circling back to that point probably later, but I just want to raise it now because
absolutely.
yeah, that seemed to be like, there was a row of men, Sheetal. I don't know if you remember this, like, row of men, older, maybe on the older side. And they were all kind of, only a couple of them spoke up, but they were, when somebody says something like that, it shouldn't just be up to the women to stand up and say, actually, no, the men should also be. And there was one man I remember who spoke up and said, no, this is not right. So, it was a conversation that I think had to be had, because it raised for us this, it reminded us that the conversations also have to happen in our own community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that conversation was so important, right, Pallavi? Not just because we were challenged on our statistics or the statistics we presented, but also to know what people really think. I think it was at least a safe space in that regard, that people could bring about their point very honestly, and we could come to know what people really think. And that emphasizes on the need for such discussions, and like you said, the need to involve men in these conversations. Neil is here, but Neil is not in that age group that those other men were, who are experienced and who are very sure of themselves also, right? Like, we know how our community looks, but possibly, one, they're thinking of domestic violence as only physical violence, like you said. And coercive control is such a big part of domestic violence, especially when you're in the US, especially when there is also the intersection of immigration, right, in our community.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I think Pallavi can talk about the legal aspects of a lot of these, but even from our own cases that we had, like, I'm not going to mention personal details or anything, but we have such a variety of stories that people often put assumptions onto these. Why do they stay? Why don't they leave? Or things like that. Why don't It's kind of interesting also that one of our community members from our cultural background would just assume that there would be so many divorces if this was actually so high of prevalence. But we know there's so much cultural backlash against things like divorce, so many taboo topics, even in our wider, I guess, just a lot of Asian cultures in general. We keep the home in the home, and we don't talk about private matters externally, things like that. And I think that deters people from getting help that they need. I also think in terms of the men, or even like that generation of men, going back to not being able to recognize that, one, it can happen in the house, and then two, it can happen in many ways. I think also just kind of reinforces that mentality of it doesn't happen because a lot of us, I mean, if it's in the house and you have a daughter and a son, the son, and if it happens, like the son will still witness it, right?
Mhm.
But I think because of the experiences the daughter often has, I think a lot of times the girls are able to more put those pieces together of like, this is a wrong behavior, this is abuse. And the men sometimes, if it's not actual hitting or beating, then in the head it's like it's no, this isn't like full abuse,
So,
and so sometimes I feel like as you kind of live a long time of that kind of mentality, it becomes that like, oh, this doesn't count, or like the numbers aren't actually this high, or why aren't they just divorcing? But we've seen in so many of our cases, the having kids makes it harder to leave. Being an immigrant makes it so much harder because your status as like, can you even stay in this country? Can you stay with your kids? Becomes an issue of if you're going to report or not. Even our legal protections, right, under the Violence Against Women Act, um, that can provide these temporary resident status and things like that to victims relies on the full cooperation with legal or law enforcement, right? They have to report and everything.
yeah,
And
like
when there's
that depends, Neil, just to interject, that depends on again their immigration status, right? So,
yes, yeah,
yeah. For example, if you are on, I think for a, I mean, Pallavi should be speaking on it basically, but correct us if we are going wrong. So, if you are on an H4 visa like situation, you would have to report your husband, correct? To law enforcement and help them get punished for them to get protection.
Yeah, so what the immigration remedy I'm most familiar with is the U visa.
Mhm.
And I oversee that process for my office, which is part of one step in the U visa process.
Mhm.
So Neil is correct to say, at least for the U visa process, and the U visa is available to immigrant victims of crimes, certain crimes. Domestic violence is one of those crimes that qualifies. The whole point of the U visa was to encourage victims who have, you know, who don't have legal status to be able to report their victimization without fear of immigration repercussions. And so they do have to be helpful
Mhm.
to the prosecution or investigation of that case. And California has a pretty broad definition of what counts as helpfulness. I'm less familiar because I don't practice immigration law with other immigration remedies, but I think what's important to note here is that abusers are pretty good at, threatening their victims. So even if it's not true, they can successfully intimidate or, deter their victim from coming forward by saying, if you report this to the police, I'm going to call immigration authorities on you. Like that's enough.
Yeah.
Right. And that's enough of a threat for a lot of these victims to then stay quiet about the abuse because they don't know. Even if the immigration system, parts of it are designed to help those victims, they don't know about it unless they're, seeking help from an immigration attorney who specializes in that particular area of law. But without that knowledge, they're not necessarily going to even be at the point where they're seeking help because they're afraid to take that first step, right?
and even if they did know, would you like, I mean, I wouldn't blame them for even not trusting the system given all
Yeah, they
the
don't.
institutional issues that you even touched on earlier.
Yeah, they don't trust the system, Neil, and also cultural. Like I've seen that so many times in the cases we get is they don't want to report their husband. Just I think it's very cultural, right? They don't want to harm their spouse, even if they are being harmed by the spouse. Like I don't know what term do we put for it. It's a very angelic vision of not doing
Guilt.
any harm, yeah, to the person who's harming you, who's like, how do I say, focused on harming you, right? They wouldn't do it even to save themselves. And that is where it's so deeply culturally rooted to be in service of your family for the women, I feel like. So
Yeah.
And on the family note, I mean, I think about some of our cases where we've had issues with the family in the home country
mm,
where they will threaten or something. And that
mm,
happens in a lot of immigrant communities, not just ours, is that the families back home can be dependent on the ones here, but they're so connected
you
still.
mean You mean the
that like the
extension?
in-laws back home,
Huh.
they might threaten the other spouse's family or something, or like there's so many just confounding variables that I
Mhm.
guess we don't often think about, but it makes it very hard on a policy level, on a service provider level, and then especially in a societal level, like just being able to recognize the prevalence of the issue when like so many times it's underreported for a multitude of these reasons, whether it's immigration status, threats from family abroad or here, or just the actual cultural or like
Hmm.
feeling of being obliged to the relationship.
I would
Yeah.
add to threats, I think I would add control from overseas, like control from your extended family who's not staying with you, right? That is also something that is so prevalent. And I also wanted to add one more thing that I have seen is like even when I mentioned the risk factors, um, I mentioned a lot of situations where it would seem like you don't belong in a, what do you say, locality, like you belong to a locality where there's a lot of violence, and you would naturally think somebody who's not doing financially well would be more at risk. But I can speak from the South Asian perspective. I have seen that if you are really well off, right? If your family is very well to do, the taboo is even higher, I feel like, because it's like my name will get soiled in the community, right? Somehow the abuse is happening to you, but I don't know why we have this feeling. I think the feeling is of being judged, so we don't want to talk about the abuse happening, right? And I've had cases also from very affluential families, and they have been enduring this for so long and are coming out only when they think like I can't, this is like the last straw, I can't do it anymore. The mental health is so fragile and they absolutely need to be helped. So again, just putting in one more factor, that let's not assume uh, your financial status or lack of is the only reason why abuse would happen to you, or only abuse happens in such families.
I think we've talked about like the kind of more financial aspect of it, the cultural aspect of it, but then there's also the social aspect. Like as social creatures, we need that social interaction, and a lot of times in patterns of abuse, there's social isolation.
Mhm.
And then, Sheetal, I know you've had some cases of character assassination. If you want to mention what that is, I think that's also a very good point to bring up in terms of the underreporting, things like that.
Yeah, two things when you talk about isolation, right? One is isolation in the like being forced to or being isolated by your abuser. And we talk about, like you mentioned, Pallavi, why if she had so much problem, they would just leave or take a divorce, right?
Yeah, I don't believe that.
I absolutely don't believe that.
Yeah.
And when they have done so, they have been socially isolated for taking the divorce.
Mm,
So it's like
mm,
we do not recognize that we are doing this to our own people, right? We are doing this to our own community members. Uh, and to This is a very specific case to what Neil was saying, where when leaving the partner, the abuser is leaving the partner, but before he leaves the partner, he makes sure she has no social support by saying things that are very like puts her character down, right? And oh my god, what a way to control somebody. Like you're leaving them, but you still want to have that power and control over them. You still want to make their life miserable, right? So it's not like as if leaving is the solution kind of thing, right? Okay, sure, leaving will help you to a certain degree, but also when people try to leave is when they're the most at danger,
yeah.
right? Now, Pallavi, you could speak more to this. People use the court systems to continue the control and abuse,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
manipulating the system. Yeah.
100%. And this is kind of a misperception too, that when a victim leaves an abusive relationship, the abuse stops.
Hmm.
Because that abuser will find other ways to control the victim, even if they're no longer in physical proximity. And that is behavior is really enabled when they have a case in family court,
Mhm.
their children in common, especially. We see this so often. I mean, it's a real tragedy throughout the country, the way that children have been harmed because they've been weaponized. So that's like the most extreme example, when an abuser seeks custody of a child. They actually don't want any custody over, but they want to be able to control the child and therefore control their ex. And then we've seen that sometimes result in the child getting killed as a way to punish the ex, the victim, right, of the intimate partner violence. We also see a lot of financial abuse in court, where the abuser is dragging out the proceedings, filing a lot of motions that have no merit, just to sort of keep the victim, in this place of financial insecurity, and sometimes resulting in like depleting their finances completely. We see a lot of harassment. The isolation piece of it is really interesting because it is a form of control. It's a way that an abuser can. I mean, it doesn't happen also overnight, right? It's not like domestic violence or any of these forms of domestic violence manifest right away. It's a really gradual process, and a lot of these behaviors are easier to enact we because of the power imbalance. So again, we're talking about systems, and systems that generally disfavor women. It's easier then for gender roles that also keep, generally speaking, women in these sort of more subservient positions, to not recognize when something is control if it doesn't involve physical violence. So things like financial control, controlling a person's bank account, right? That may not be seen as abuse. Isolating them from their family and friends, telling them, who they should talk to, how they should dress, just kind of the micromanagement of their daily behavior. To some extent, that's normalized. And so victims don't always see that as abuse. It makes it harder to leave. And then, as you pointed out, Sheetal, when they do finally leave, there is this systemic betrayal that happens by institutions like the family court. And then also, I think your point about betrayal, you didn't use this word, but I do see that as a betrayal, when we as a community kind of turn our backs on that person who's
Mhm.
found the courage to leave, to either, judge their decision, or, critique it in some way, blame them.
Blame them, yeah.
And that is, I think, in the South Asian culture, because of the reach of the extended family, that can be particularly problematic, especially when it's filtering down to the children who are
Right.
hearing things, and then that pattern can, that normalization of the violence,
Right. And also,
reenacted by the children, right?
you're saying specific, like to the South Asian culture, and I thought also, I think because of the strict gender norms we have, like of thinking of a woman who has her main role is to keep the family together, act in the best interest of the family, right? And I think there must be generations of women who have, like, even if they were financially independent, who might have stayed back in an abusive marriage because that is their duty, to,
Mm.
to not let the family fall apart. So, I mean, I just wanted to add that to your point from the cultural lens.
Yeah, and so I feel like this is something I think about too. Like, we have all these laws in the US, but also in India. I, had at one point started looking into laws in India around domestic violence, and they have these laws set up, but there's always a challenge when you have laws enacted. Like, are we implementing them? Are we aware of them, first of all? And then, are the people who have the power to implement them actually implementing them effectively and fairly? And then beyond that, has society caught up to the law? And I think that's where we're not really there yet. I mean, just as kind of demonstrated by that conversation in that small community forum, like, we haven't caught up to
Mhm.
the law. So the law is great, but if we as a society haven't really embrace the law and what it's meant to do. And we're still telling these victims they should stay, they should make it work for the sake of the children, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we're not really moving the needle. So that's part of what we're talking about today. Like, how do we move that needle and really embed these conversations in our larger institutions, religious, cultural, our families, right? How do we have these conversations?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the South Asian culture, right? Like what we have been, and we'll discuss this in more in detail later. I absolutely agree with you, Pallavi. We need to bring this more onto the community level, right? And mm, maybe we can just talk about what different community levels we need to bring them up. So when we want to bring change, how do we bring it? We could say we want to create an egalitarian community, we want to engage men in our discussions, but there's so many levels at which it can be done, right? So we call it the socio-ecological model, and in the Sati program we have been implementing this. So the whole point of the Sati program is, I mean, the tagline is partners in harmony. So the whole point is to have a more harmonious family. And it's not an easy change to bring, because we need to work on, like, again, the socio-ecological model. So that would be on the individuals. So that would be educating the men, educating the women, educating the teens, right, on what healthy relationships are in the first place. We think a lot of things, we might believe a lot of things are acceptable, but they might not really be healthy, right? Even if it's like acceptable in the culture, they might not be healthy. So we need to learn that as individuals, and I think we need to implement them in our relationships. So that is like healthy communications when it comes to couples, healthy communication when it comes to parent child, and also like your parenting. One added, I think immigration is such a big piece when we talk about any topic in the South Asian community, and which applies also to intimate partner violence, domestic violence. Um, a second. So the second part of the socio-ecological model is relationships, right? So it is important, and we do that in our Sati program. And if you can see the Hathis behind me, which are the mascot for Sati, our project, is a family, right? Family as a unit. And that is what we want to work on individual levels with women, men, children, and also at the relationship level, where we are talking about good, healthy communication skills. We are talking about good parenting, bicultural parenting, where, because, as an immigrant community, we are we are in this place where our kids are growing up as American. We are South Asian, and we are very afraid of the changes or the way they're growing, or we don't understand how to raise them. So our program Sati offers these parenting sessions, and we have experts who come and talk about it. And I think that it's very important to bridge that gap in our community, and that's how we work at the relationship level. At the community level, we have been in talks over the past 3 years and more with religious leaders, and I love this part of our work where we are talking to community leaders, um, religious leaders, schools, and we are kind of starting this movement of change where, we are connecting with, let me give you an example, uh, with one pandit at a temple, right, explaining them how domestic violence looks in our community, how we as a community organization help prevent and intervene in such situations. And a lot of the times we have had success where, people are coming to the panditji and talking to them about the problems they face, and then they're connecting them to us, correct, to Saahas, and we are able to provide them services that way. I mean, we cannot expect everyone to come to Saahas directly. A lot of the times people would go to the community leaders, right, thinking they'll be able to help. And that is why our work of talking to community leaders is so important, political leaders is so important, because when we talk to them, and like Pallavi, I mentioned in that event, we were together, we were talking to community leaders. We had to convince them first that this does happen, right? There is a prevalence. And only then, once they understand, will they be open to helping other people, right? If their biases are, they're able to keep it on the side, they're able to have a deeper understanding of what domestic violence looks in our community, that it's not just, once again I'm reiterating this, it's not just a physical abuse, it's also coercive control, it's also digital like, controlling what you're doing on your device, or controlling you through your kids. There's so many different ways, controlling the money, not letting you speak to your parents back home unless you do something, in a particular way that they want. These are all parts of domestic abuse. And I think it is very necessary that the religious leaders, the community leaders in South Asian community understand this. And I think we are also, just to bring about that community aspect, we have not just workshops that we do for this, we also have events, like the Start Grow Scale, and we did Start Grow Scale 3.0. That's like the third year. We did this where we are connecting people to opportunities, right? Of like financial opportunities, by guiding them to start their own businesses, or connecting them for new jobs, or getting new jobs skills, so that they can, land up with a job in the long run. And I think the community coming together for each other is very necessary. And I think it's also, we created a booklet. So Neil and I and the Saahas youth worked on this, where understanding teen relationship booklet we created, where we are kind of marking that this is what healthy relationship looks like, this is what unhealthy relationship looks like, this is what toxic relationship looks like, this is what digital safety looks like. And to be honest, when we were creating this, we were a little apprehensive that South Asian parents might not be very open to picking that book up. But that's where the role of the community is. The parents were open to it, the students were open to it, and we're hoping, like, through such initiatives that we are doing through the Sati program, we are able to bring about that change in the community, where every stakeholder in the community, which also includes schools, who we work with a lot in the Sati work, are able to help us bring this change about. Right? I think we work with ABC School District. We work with different school districts in Orange County, and they're very open to us, and it's important, where we are able to give them cultural competency on what South Asian culture looks like, so that they're able to serve their South Asian students better as counselors and teachers. And yeah, I think everybody is needed for this movement, which brings to the next level of the socio-ecological model, which is society. And I think you both are very passionate about policy. So yeah, let's hear it from you.
Sure. So a lot of what I do in my role is related to, well, the creation of legislation, and then ensuring that legislation that is enacted is actually implemented. So I'll give an example. In 2019, we've talked about how domestic violence is beyond physical violence, but a lot of my experience in court and working with survivors, it taught me that concept of non-physical abuse wasn't really captured adequately by the law. So I worked on drafting legislation that would add the definition of coercive control to California law. So that was something that I drafted along with family law attorneys, because ultimately we were able to add that definition to the family code in California. So something I'll just point out really briefly is that even within a single state like California, we actually have different definitions of domestic violence that vary according to the law we're talking about. So the criminal law has one definition, the family law has another. So you can imagine, for survivors who are experiencing these non-physical forms of abuse, if they don't have the language for that in the law, they don't know that it's abuse, and then they're unable to get a remedy for it. So the definition of coercive control, we were able to get codified, and it's now part of the family code effective 2021. And it includes things like, well, first, let me say, coercive control is defined as a deprivation of personal liberty. So that's the general definition. And then we were able to list specific examples, a lot of which have come up in our conversation today: isolation from family, friends, or other sources of support, withdrawal of or deprivation of basic necessities, control, including control based on immigration status. We were really deliberate about putting that language in there because of what we see with immigrant victims of domestic violence. And the following year, reproductive coercion was added as a category of coercive control. And that is a form of control that deprives a person, and we're talking usually about a woman here, but I suppose it could also, this is not specific. This law applies equally across genders, right? But the way we see reproductive coercion is through control over a person's reproductive autonomy. So things like denial of access to contraception, forced abortions, or forced pregnancies. So these are all examples of non-physical forms of abuse that strip away a person's agency over their lives and over their bodies. This is a law. This is an actual law. And I've worked on other laws that are really aimed at kind of bridging the gap between a survivor's experience and the law, right? So ensuring that the law captures and provides a remedy for the harm that they've suffered. But what I want to point out is that these are laws that are specific to California. There are other states that have since created laws codifying coercive control that have borrowed from California's law, but a lot of states don't have that definition. And so each state has its own set of laws. And again, those laws are not necessarily uniform even within a single state, right? So there's different, like criminal and family law. So we're talking about, for a particular survivor, their access to the law and the remedies that they can seek under the law will be dependent on where they live. They may not have the same access to the definitions that we have in California. They might not have the same access to restraining orders that we have in California. I think we have to stop, right? So another area of law where we see, I would call it inequality because the laws provide differing levels of protection to victims. Sheetal, you had mentioned that when a victim leaves the abusive relationship, that's the most dangerous time. And that's true. And a lot of times these victims who are leaving will seek, as one step in their process of leaving, they will seek a restraining order in family court. That is the most dangerous time as well. And the reason it's really dangerous is because, again, now the relationship is over, or the victim is signaling that they are ending the relationship. And that means for the abuser a loss of control. So a way to reassert that control is by, the abuser can do that in any number of ways. They can intimidate the victim, try to get them to drop the restraining order. And unfortunately, a situation that I have seen in my experience is when the abuser violates the restraining order and kills that victim. And that's the ultimate form of control, right? Taking somebody's life. So there are also laws that I work on implementing related to domestic violence restraining orders. So one thing that's not uniform across the country is whether or not a person who is subject to a restraining order should be allowed to have access to guns. In California, if a person is restrained by a domestic violence restraining order, they are not allowed to have guns while that restraining order is in effect. That is not true across the country. And actually, we've been seeing challenges to the federal version of that law, which has been challenged specifically on Second Amendment grounds. So just this past year, the US Supreme Court upheld the federal prohibition, which amounts to the same thing that we have in California, but it's on the federal level, and it prevents a restrained party in a domestic violence case from owning or possessing a firearm. And I bring this up because it's one of those laws, and we have in California all of these laws related to restraining orders and gun possession. But again, the success of the law is dependent on its implementation. And so we have seen challenges in implementing that particular law that prevents restrained parties from having access to guns. And it's so important that we get that right because of the intersection between gun violence and intimate partner violence. So access to a gun makes it 5 times more likely that a woman will die at the hands of her abuser. And we actually have studies that show that laws that keep guns out of the hands of abusers, or states that have these laws, have lower rates of intimate partner homicide. So these are laws that, when implemented, actually work. And it's my job, one of my jobs is to ensure that the laws that we have on the books in California are actually being implemented successfully so that survivors aren't falling through the gaps. But again, this is not true of the entire country. And that's where it's really kind of heartbreaking that a victim in one part of the country isn't going to have the same access to laws that disarm prohibited parties or access to laws that prohibit reproductive coercion. And we're talking about one country. And so I think that's just an unfortunate reality of living in a country where there are different states with different levels of protections for victims. So that's really what I try to work on. Obviously, I can't fix every state's laws, but I think that's where, conversations around how we can improve laws and working together with our partners in other states is really important. Yeah. So I know, Neil, you're really interested in policy as well, and I definitely want to hear your perspective. What this looks like for you.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, as a young person, I think gun violence obviously is something that has been very prevalent for my generation, especially in regards to mass shootings, school shootings, things like that. And I remember after the Uvalde shooting, I was able to get a sponsored flight and stay in DC with March for Our Lives to do lobbying for some sort of gun violence or gun reform package. And I remember there was such a huge national movement after that school shooting in Texas, and we spent the week lobbying to members of the Senate and the House, and this was federal Congress, so like the big guys, and so much work was put in place for what I describe as kind of a measly reform package. It was our like bipartisan reform bill or whatever, and then I think the next summer, either probably like a week before or after or a few days before or after the Roe v. Wade was overturned, actually, they also had a new SCOTUS ruling on public possession of firearms and things like that. And the point I'm getting at is that not only is it so discrepant between states, in terms of like chronology, it's just so much back and forth in terms of policy of granting protections and then rescinding those or putting in other legal measures for intersectional issues like gun violence and then rolling back on those. And it's always this kind of like push or shove. And I think from the perspective of like someone who provides the services to the victims. And like what we mentioned earlier with kind of the public charge notice and the immigration status, that there's so many factors that sway back and forth the movement. But at the end of the day, who is the one that suffers? It's these victims. And I think that's why it's so important to address like every level. We in Sati or in our Family Women Wellness Initiative, we have Sati for intimate partner violence prevention, but then we also have our intervention services for DV victims, and we have the other events we post we host to promote the other protective factors. But then also on each level of the socio-ecological model, we have to make sure we hit every one of those. But I also think it's not just us as service providers or community advocates who address all of them. I think it's honestly every level of the model has to address every level of the model. So that means individuals connecting with like communities, engaging in some harder discussions. That also means individuals taking an extra, especially people like us who are privileged enough to not experience these issues, it has to come from us to educate ourselves about these things and then advocate on behalf of the victims, advocate for the systems and the legal protections. And then it's on our community to protect the individuals, right? Like we talked about, our community tends to turn its back on the individuals who are experiencing those issues. And so what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that like everybody on every level needs to be involved at every level.
And
And
sorry,
yeah, continue.
just wanted to add, because we're talking about the intersection of with gun violence, right? And often in our community the thought is like, oh, that doesn't, again, it doesn't happen, right? Oh, where's gun violence? And I just wanted to bring in this point that last year during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we focused on two stories called Lost Stories, about two South Asian women who lost their life to gun violence, right? And I remember discussing this with community leader, and I'm kind of trying to highlight that the response I got was, oh, that it's a one-off case, which it is not. These are cases that, like all the cases that we discussed today, right? I think most of them are instances which get highlighted in the news, and there are so many that are truly lost, so many stories, so many lives that are truly lost. And like you said, it has to happen at every level. I think at community leaders and individuals need to recognize that the intersection of domestic violence with gun violence does most certainly happen in our community as well. So yeah, I just wanted to interject on that point.
And I want to jump in because this isn't a statistic that I gave, but Neil's, his points remind me of something that it's a statistic that I'm really familiar with and I forget, but it's pretty horrifying, the connection between domestic violence and mass shootings. So more than 2/3 of mass shootings are either direct domestic violence incidents or they are carried out by shooters who have a history of domestic violence. So when we talk about domestic violence as a thing, or a particular incident of domestic violence as like a one-off or a thing that only affects one part of our community or another community altogether, we're forgetting that, domestic violence is tied into almost every area you can think of, and particularly with respect to shootings that affect everybody, but also homelessness, domestic violence, survivors are overrepresented among the homeless population. And so we really can't say accurately, or like, we can't say with a straight face, like, oh, this doesn't affect me, because it affects all of us. Even if it's not directly affecting us, we know somebody who's been affected by it, or we've, been witness to something like a mass shooting, which unfortunately, has become so common in our country.
Which
yeah,
Pallavi, I just looked up the stats and it's nearly 70%. And that is shocking. Yeah.
Yeah, it is pretty shocking. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's something that we live with, all of us. So we're all affected by it.
Thank you for bringing that point up. That was news to me. And like you said, it affects us all in one way or another, even if it is happening at our home or not. And just to add, like, it might not be happening in your family today, but what if in the future, right? A kid who has been subject to adverse childhood effects, right? What we call ACEs, who has seen domestic violence, who has been subject to domestic violence, becomes a perpetrator, and one of your kids is their partner, right? So we're thinking in silos where we feel like, oh, not my family, I don't have to worry. but keep making the society a better place to live, a violence-free place to live, I think in everybody's, uh, it's for everybody's better. Sorry, I want you to go back to policies and just wanted to bring how important societal level is also.
Um,
Yeah.
and so when all the states have different laws, and then the federal law has different protocols than the state laws, but the federal law is supreme to the state laws, how well does that kind of work together to, I guess, protect the victim or make it harder for them?
I mean, it definitely doesn't help because it's confusing, right? Like, even, I mean, I'm in this space and I can't tell you like what a state in the middle of the country is doing, and how a victim there could be protected if their partner lives in another state. The short answer is that the court with jurisdiction over the case, whatever state that court is in, that state's law will prevail. But it's definitely a problem, especially because domestic violence is one of those things that is kind of, it moves, right? So like an abuser can have a victim in one county or even one city, and then that victim might flee and go to another city, and then that abuser will follow them. And so you can see like the abuse, it will move with the abuser and will follow the victim too. So if they're moving from city to city or county to county, that's a lot easier if they're still in one state than like a victim who's leaving. And I'm sure a lot of, I'm guessing a lot of our victims, the victims that you see are maybe relocating, leaving the state. So it's confusing. It's not helpful to a victim who's already dealing with a lot of trauma to have to navigate that legal system and those definitions. And it's just, again, it's an unfortunate reality that we often leave the victim to sort it out. But luckily, we have organizations like Saahas that can help with that. But it's not straightforward by any means, and it is complicated when the government is enacting laws or the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, is striking down laws, and they're doing so in a way that affects only, part of the country. And that can be really confusing too. We're seeing a lot of that now. And so, again, it just, what that means is that a victim living in one part of the country may be getting less protection than a victim in another part of the country.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, Mhm. Yeah, just adding to your point, there we do see a lot of cases where they're fleeing, from one state to another so that they get better protection, and it's only re-traumatizing, right? And also having to find all the resources again in a new county or a new state. So yeah, like you said, it doesn't really help the victims.
Yeah, even once they come into like a state, like if they come to California, for example, and Sajas is operating in California, it's even hard if they live in a different county or like they come into a county. Sajas operates in Los Angeles and Orange counties, and even within those, there are different resource centers. DPSS has a different, the Department of like social services and everything is different. You go through that office, moving from one county to another, whether it's like 5 miles apart from city to city, is still, I think, just poses such challenges. So from like the legal perspective, Pallavi, you mentioned so many different instances of like the confusion, I guess, and how that makes it hard to protect the victims.
Yeah, and imagine if your victim doesn't have a car, has childcare issues, has immigration issues, like it's like I mean,
Right.
it's impossible.
And and that leads me to what I was going to ask Sheetal is, I mean, from our perspective, working in a CBO that provides these services to DV victims, what kind of, I guess, challenges or areas of improvement is there from like the CBO side for like being able to help these victims? And I mean, just I can answer the first part right of off the bat of what Pallavi said in terms of like, I mean, I don't have a car. It's a struggle for me to get to office, right? Can you imagine like a DV victim without a car going to the court cases, going to the doctor's office for their kids, and there are all these very little things.
Correct. So yeah, a good question, Neil. And
Um, and especially if there was financial abuse, lack of financial security. Did I lag?
Yeah, I think maybe, but that's okay. So I was
Okay,
saying,
yeah. Like, yeah, okay, so we can't, there are all these little things that the victims sometimes can't provide. But then even if they go to an organization for help, if there's no like kind of discretionary funds for that, or um, if you're like extremely grant based and grants to allocate for this thing, even on our end, sometimes we feel a little helpless or powerless to, um, I guess, materially help the victims as well, right? So
correct.
if you want to expand on
Yeah.
that.
So, two things, right, Neil, and even to the previous point, Pallavi, a lot of times we have like South Asian coalitions or API coalitions, and these coalitions are really helpful. Like, if I don't have the funds, I can try to ask. We don't have a shelter, right? We try to give them emergency stay till a shelter opens up the space for them. So, I think collaborating with other organizations in who do similar work as yours is very important. Building coalitions is very important. And you bring about a very good point, Neil, about not when you're very grant based, you might not have money for a sudden need that arises, right, for a client. um, we have tried to think about this ahead of time and write some things in the grant, and then we also depend a lot on the community's involvement, including donations, so that we can like earmark some money especially for such needs of clients. We also, for example, we have classes for, I think that this coming year we will be able to provide classes for DV victims who are not able to pay. Like, we'll be able to pay a portion of their DMV classes, right, for driving, like learning how to drive. And we try to help. Again, we try to help. Like you said, there are no funds that the government or like the grants allow you to keep for giving it to a client to maybe buy a car, correct? Because then transport is such an important aspect. Like, you can't take your child to, it kind of holds you in place, right? You can't take your child to school, groceries, and you're so dependent on somebody else. And we know that, like, the transport system, the public transport system here is not so great. So I think, yes, to your point, it does affect survivors a lot. And we try to help them through writing some parts of it into our grant, that we need money for this. We time and again reach out to our community members for this, that we need help for such and such client, for providing them with transportation. And we try again through our programs to enable and to how do you say, empower the survivors to be more independent. So, like, helping them pass their DMV or the citizenship test, right, by being that um, pillar of assistance, I would say. Yeah. Neil, is there something else that you're asking in this question?
No, I was just hoping you could expand on that a little because I think we talked a lot about the context of the issue, the different forms, and just the complexity of the
Yeah.
domestic violence issue. That I also feel like or I just felt like we could share some of the struggles that we also face in helping these victims so that at least our audience, can
Mhm.
get a little more insight into the different, I guess, groups that are addressing the issue. But even still, no matter how many groups or how many coalitions we have, like at the end of the day, there are certain fundamental issues that prevent us from fully helping our victims. And I think
Yeah,
obviously funding being one of them,
funding.
and internal capacity, but then of course things like community engagement and support from individuals, community leaders, and that whole, I think,
I think this is where I would want to compliment the community and community leaders, right? I have had certain cases where it's not easy to help. I remember one particular case when a woman was she had to flee, or she was asked to leave her home in, I think, Saturday night or something like that, right, when organizations close. And I remember, like, Payal and I and some other organizations and individuals uh, connecting over the weekend so that she was not I think it happened in the morning, so that we were really rushing, so that by the nightfall she had some place to stay at, right? And that's happened in multiple cases. And I think this is these cases, especially around housing, and when we need a car, we need to buy a car for a client, or like washing machine for a client, because there's coercive control around that too. I mean, you wouldn't know, like, what has laundry got to do with domestic violence? But the coercive control can work in very strange ways, like you cannot leave the house for anything, right? So then you need something to be in house, or you're not getting any support for taking care of your child when when you have to go do laundry. There's so many different ways these things can present, abuse can present. And this is where community members and their generosity really helps us and has helped us. And this is where we actually want more involvement. I mean, you could volunteer, you could donate, right? You could be involved with us in so many ways that would help a client. Yeah.
I definitely agree. I think it's just, as we mentioned, just such a prevalent issue on so many, like every lever or layer of the socio-ecological model, every country, I mean, every city. It's just
Too
kind
many
of an
people.
issue that we also are choosing to selectively ignore in many levels. And um, while there's so much movement for awareness, like this month and what we're doing here, I think there needs to be more. And I think that's why we're also having this conversation that we need the community engagement and the passionate involvement for our movement to succeed. And I think the change will be slow, but it will be incremental, and every little increment is impactful and important. But that all starts with the initiative we take as individuals to alleviate the situation in any of the ways that you said. And I think what we should also end on, or something that I want to mention, is if this issue surrounds power and control, I want to also bring back some power to the victims, or do some victim empowerment, in the sense that maybe after hearing this, there are some people who realize that they might be in an abusive or even toxic relationship, that there's help out there, that the victims have been through so much and are going through all these issues that we talked about, that I want to say it's important to also support your mental health as well, and engage in not just the services organizations like ours provide for emergency housing or things like that, or parenting workshops, but they're also like our support groups. We do those every week for our victims, and building back that sense of community, especially after social isolation, and then being able to process properly what has happened in a lot of situations, I think is very important. And so I just want to end on the note that getting help for yourself is also very important. And so I urge um, whoever needs help to reach out for help, and that we as individuals and as a community and as an organization and hopefully as a society are here for our victims. And so eventually we won't have to have this DVM, or Domestic Violence Awareness Month, that hopefully our movement can continue to grow. And um, yeah, I mean, thank you for all the people who are part of the movement, the people who are listening to this presentation and or this discussion. And of course, thank you for you two for being part of the discussion and all the work you do, especially you, Pallavi. You're kind of like my superstar now after hearing you draft all the legislation that's so important in protecting people's lives. It really is important work. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you to everyone who's involved in the movement.
Pallavi has is like, especially, I mean, always, but especially in the Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I think she has a cape on, and right, Pallavi, you're spreading the word, getting the community more involved, and spreading more information so that we could have a healthier world.
Thank you. Well, thank you for making the space for this conversation. And yeah, hopefully one day, we won't have to gather in this way. We can look back and think, we've been able to solve this problem, but it does take all of us working together collectively to end domestic violence. So I just thank you for elevating the issue and for all the work you're both doing.
Thank you, Pallavi. And just to end, I would like to say to every individual listening to us today, join the movement by practicing healthier communications in your family, learn better parenting skills, and get involved in community movements. Don't wait for domestic violence or teen dating violence to happen to your sister, to your brother, to your child. Your involvement will bring the change. And let's break this cycle of violence by learning about and adopting healthier behaviors and belief. Let us create a community where violence is not tolerated or accepted.
For more information, visit saahasforcause.org to see all of our educational material and events and ways to get involved. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.